Thank you all for coming. My name is Lucy King. I am a full stack engineering fellow at the US Census Bureau, and I'm also a junior at Columbia University studying computer science. So, my project this summer focused on developing a user-friendly query builder for the Census Bureau's International Trade API to increase public access to the really integral resource that the Trade API has. So, to get started on some background of why the International Trade API is important, and why it's important that it's easily accessible. The Trade API provides continuous monthly data on all of the US's imports and exports in a really, really thorough level of detail. So there's 9 different classification systems that the API uses, and each of those has its own method of classifying what commodities are being imported or exported in various levels of detail. So there's a huge amount of information that you can gain from this, from everything from, oh, someone has imported a meat product to someone has imported like frozen chicken breasts from this specific trade partner. So you can get a very, very wide range of data from the API. The API format is also very convenient because one is able to write API calls that they can automatically integrate into their own projects. So it's a really helpful resource for a lot of public agencies, academic researchers, and members of the public in general for accessing US trade data. However, as you can see from this example query in the lower left corner here, the API can be a little bit complicated to query. You got to be really familiar with the trade API's jargon, and you also have to be familiar with the structure of API calls in general, which many in the public, and especially if you're working in economics or international trade as a field, you might not be as familiar with that system. So that kind of introduces where we come in and what our goal is. There are a few existing resources for helping users to interact with the Trade API, and our goal is to kind of build on these previous resources and create an accessible user interface for users who are new to the API to get access to its data while also getting more familiar with the API system overall. So the first of these existing resources is the International Trade API's user guide, which is literally just like a 28-page document that contains all of the information you would need to know about the API, all sorts of formatting requirements, parameters that are required to be included with other parameters, parameters that are invalid when used in conjunction with other parameters, all that sort of information. And so while this is obviously incredibly helpful, it has quite a sharp learning curve and it can be hard to absorb quickly. So for newer users or for more casual users who don't necessarily need to be API experts, but just want to access the data available through the API, this can be challenging to kind of navigate at first. Kind of on the other end of the spectrum is USA Trade Online, which is an online user interface that has really expansive functionality for allowing users to access trade data separately from the API, but a similar trade resource. However, USA Trade Online has this really expansive functionality. It can be harder to navigate for newer users. And you also don't get the benefit of having access to an API call. So if you want to automatically requery or get more information from the trade data source, you would have to manually go back into Trade Online and query it again, which is very much not super helpful for a lot of purposes. So our intention was to develop a query builder that kind of is in between these two resources, so providing the user interface that USA Trade Online has, but also providing access to the API, the way the user guide helps get users get access to, and kind of in conjunction, teaching the users how to use the API to empower them for future, more complicated use. So our specific methodology for getting there is that we wanted to develop a query builder that allows users to select from a list of parameters that list not only the code for the parameter that would be included in the API call, but also a description of what that code is. So users are still getting access and understanding the API call system, but have some kind of assistance throughout that process. And we also wanted to give access to both the API call and efficient access to viewing and exporting the data that the user is interested in accessing. So again, we're kind of bridging the gap between the API and USA Trade Online that gives you direct access to download trade data. Finally, we wanted this query builder to be integrated directly into the existing Census website so that anyone who accesses the Trade API also has access to this query builder. For a little bit more on kind of the technical backend side, we built out this query builder with an Angular front end, so that supports when the users submit parameters. It also reflects the data table that's ultimately queried and gives the user the ability to export data, select their parameters, view a lot of documentation information on how to select those parameters, stuff like that. And on the back end to support that, we have a Flask API that formats the submitted parameters into an API call and interfaces directly with the trade API to query it and format the resulting data into a format compatible with the front end side. One of the key components of this project was that we wanted to ensure that everything we were pulling from the trade API was dynamic. So if there are any changes to the information available in the trade API, that is all automatically reflected in our front end. So everything from what endpoints are available to what parameters are available for each endpoint and what values are compatible with each parameter, that will be consistently updated. And that's especially important for something like commodity codes or country codes that change very often. So generally reducing maintenance and kind of easing that process. Here I have a quick little demo just to show you how this kind of materialized. Let's see if yes, okay. So initially the users select the initial parameters, that's time interval, and the commodity classification system that they're interested in. And we give them some options of how to format their API call throughout this process. Once they've done that, they can access the parameters that are specific to that endpoint and time interval. And for those that have many values, like commodity codes can have thousands of values, we have them in this drop-down format for more readability. And our API call is formatted dynamically, so the users can get familiar with which parameters kind of change the API call in which way. We also handle formatting and special characters, as you saw, and users can search directly for whichever parameters they're interested in. So once a user is happy with the API call they found, they can copy it, use it directly in their own projects, or they can submit it within this portal, see the resulting data, experiment with it, look through it, and export it in whichever format they are looking for. So our main objective here was to cover the basic functionality of the API with the idea that future more advanced functionality could come after a user is more familiar with this initial process. And also that this query builder could later be expanded to include those more advanced functionalities as well. There we go. So currently we have our query builder developed and we're currently entering the kind of deployment process to get approval for an external facing web page to add to the Census web page. So that will be kind of the next few steps in this project over the next few months. And as I mentioned before, there's also some additional functionality that it might be helpful to add to the query builder. So specifically, we could add summary level support, which is an alternative way to write API calls for the trade API specifically that can make them much more concise. And it's a really great option for more advanced users who are looking to make many API calls and want to have a lot of access to changing them easily. But it doesn't provide access to any new data source. It's just an alternative querying method. So that's something that we could support to teach more advanced users. And it also could be helpful to have an optional account creation process to kind of bridge the gap between this service and USA Trade Online. USA Trade Online requires account creation, which can be a burden for certain users who aren't interested in storing their past queries. But if users are interested in that feature, adding it as an optional option on this query builder could also kind of be helpful to combine those two resources. Finally, it might also be helpful to expand this general format to other Census APIs because we built out this query builder to pull directly from the API and to not hard code any information specific to the trade API. It would be relatively simple to transport this current module to other APIs of a similar format. And so that's something that might also be exciting for future steps. And with that, that's a high-level overview of what I've been working on this summer. I'm really grateful to have had this opportunity. I learned a ton throughout this summer, and I'm especially grateful to the macroanalysis branch who has provided this opportunity and really helped me kind of solidify what I'm working on, and Jason specifically for his mentorship throughout this project as well. Yeah, and thank you all for listening and coming to this presentation. So I really appreciate it. If anyone has any questions, feel free to pop up. I think I should be able to see you. So yeah, thank you. Yes, Crystal?
Yeah, just quick question. I was just wondering if you're going to stay longer to follow the project through, or are you going to hand it off on Friday?
At this point, the plan is to hand it off. So because I finished like the code development part and written up some documentation for passing it on to the team, that's kind of the plan. But I would love to stay in touch with my team as kind of like the deployment process continues. There's a lot of regulatory steps that I'm not necessarily as familiar with in that process. I would love to stay in touch with that, but I won't be like actively like the primary person working on the project anymore. But that's a great question. Thank you. Remy?
Yeah. So first question is this is a public API, right?
Yes, yeah. So the data is already public. This query builder just kind of builds on top of that to make it easier to access already available data.
Cool. So my second question is, have you folks thought about sharing this open source anywhere else outside of the agency, like on GitHub or something?
That would be really cool. I haven't thought of that as of now, but I think that's a really cool suggestion. Yeah, it's all interacts directly with the Trade API, as you said. So there's nothing about this specific query builder that would not be able to be shared publicly. So that's definitely something that we could consider in the future. That's a good idea. So thank you. Any other questions? No.
Well, if there's no other questions, I just want to say, Allison, you did a wonderful job. Sorry, Lucy, you did a great job for us. Um, the API has become one of our primary dissemination tools, and we have these vast data sets that people find it really terrifying to try to pull data from. And this is exactly what we needed. And so I just want to take this opportunity to thank Lucy for her incredible work these past couple months.
Thank you, Jason. I really appreciate it. Jason has been an absolutely incredible supervisor and mentor. So I have learned a ton from him and was really lucky to get to work on this project. And yeah, it was super cool to learn about the Trade API too. I didn't realize that we had like an API resource for that. So it's been a really cool addition to like trade data in general. And so it's cool to see future expansions and this project kind of working into making that more widely available as well. Yeah. If no one has any other questions, I can also talk a little bit more about kind of like what future expansions or like if I had more time, how I would change or improve this project. Um, I think at this point we experimented a lot with making the parameter collection process faster. The Trade API itself, so going back to this slide. The Trade API itself takes a few seconds to query, and that kind of response time is very variable. So sometimes it'll take 5 seconds, sometimes it'll take 35 seconds, which is obviously not a great experience for the user. So one of our like primary tasks for this project was to accelerate the parameter search component so that every time a user selects a classification system, we're able to pull those parameters very quickly. And so that required a lot of reformatting, and we ended up settling on this format where we kind of like pre-collect all the parameters, get them directly from the Trade API, and then handle all of the value processing and stuff after making like one initial API call instead of making multiple API calls. And so I think that is a process that could probably be further iterated on. I think that would be an opportunity maybe to implement some like parallel programming stuff to make more smaller API calls that might be slightly faster process. So I think that's something that would be cool to see kind of from the back end improvements for this project. Um, and let's see. Yeah, I think oh, yes, for me.
I don't know if I missed this earlier, but how often is the trade data updated on the back end?
So the data, like the actual import and export data, is updated monthly. And the commodity codes specifically are the ones that like change frequently as the US imports new commodities or commodity classification systems change and new levels of detail are needed and stuff like that. And I believe Jason and I talked about like every 3 to 6 months, there's often changes in that. But the actual data inside the API is updated monthly to keep up with like the most recent import and export monthly release. So yeah, good question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all the time we have, but thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for your questions and have a good rest of your day. Bye.